Okay, and so we will go ahead and get started with today's Q&A. So hello everyone, and welcome to the 10-Minute Walk Learning Series question and answer session. My name is Jared Mummert, and I'm a program specialist at NRPA working on the 10-Minute Walk campaign. Today we are going to dive deep into equity in parks and recreation. And joining me are four panelists whose work varies from community programming and activation, park design, and planning and policies, which are all grounded in equity. And so before we get to your questions, I know we have some folks who are a little less familiar with the 10-Minute Walk campaign. So I just want to take a moment to give you a brief overview of the campaign in this learning series. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and so my slideshow should be up now. So the 10-Minute Walk campaign was launched in October 2017 by the Trust for Public Land, NRPA, and the Urban Land Institute. Now, these three organizations represent different interests in parks and recreation, and they came together around the idea that everyone deserves a great park close to home. We currently have over 220 mayors signed on to the campaign, representing cities in every state. And as a part of this campaign, we are providing tools for park professionals to have the opportunity to achieve the 10-Minute Walk campaign goals in their cities. And so this learning series will be made up of videos of best practices and case studies from your peers in the field. Our last focus was on partnerships and coalition building, which you can view on the 10-Minute Walk Learning Series webpage. And our next topic is going to be community engagement. So these videos will be followed then by a question and answer session where you will have the opportunity to ask your peers directly some questions about whatever the topic is. And that's what we're here to do today. So I will stop sharing. And now I'd like to take a moment for our panelists to introduce themselves. And first up is Joy Keebler, who is a landscape architect from Buffalo, New York.
Yes, thank you, Jared. It's great to be here. And with all of the attendees, thank you so much for joining us. As Jared said, yeah, I'm Joy Keebler. I'm a landscape architect in Buffalo. Have been speaking in the world of play and recreation for a long time, and was asked to participate here today, and along with the 10-minute video series. So while I know the upcoming Q&A session will be on community engagement, we'll be touching on that a little bit here as well, but particular to how we do that. So I think all of the participants have probably been through the typical community engagement that is often about a public meeting notice in the newspaper, and maybe you get 50 people, or maybe you get 5 people. And sometimes the engagement is geared around the project owner or the project design team have some ideas, and we want to run those by you and get your opinions on what we think. And what we've been finding is that that doesn't always allow a lot of equity in participation and voices being at the table, and a lot of space for a variety of conversations to happen, instead of it just being sort of, this is what we think and tell us if you agree. So a few years back, my company kind of took on community engagement in a different kind of way, and particularly looking at what had been really successful for organizational development and team builders. And why would they get lots of participation, and why do we get little participation, when essentially the two are trying to find some strategy and some consensus to move a strategy forward. And we found that the missing link was play, which brings us today, why we're kind of part of this conversation, in that every single human on the planet knows how to play. In fact, it's so innate, it's so ingrained that you can not play. So we've adapted that approach playing as community engagement with the intention of building conversation and allowing the community to kind of find aha moments for themselves out on a site, or when they're considering the possibilities for improvements to their sidewalk, to their streetscape, to their park, to their schoolyard, and really allowing them to see the site analysis and come up with the aha, you mean, what if we had this? And the design team could have suggested that, but because it's generated from inside the community in a way that's around using play as collaborative problem solving and consensus building, those ideas not only take root, they start to shape a project very differently. And the outcome is different in the number of community champions that we have for a project, and that it's really generated from inside. And people have a great time doing it and see a lot of opportunities for themselves that they might not have seen before. And as a design team, we're able to move a project forward that has a really strong community commitment. So that's my 2-minute spiel.
Thanks, Joy. That was great. Up next, we have Hamlin, who is the Recreation Facilities Project Manager for Milwaukee Public Schools Department of Recreation and Community Services.
Thanks, Jared, and thanks everyone for attending. Like Jared said, I'm Pam Lynn. I've been in my position for about 2 years, and I was hired to implement our facilities master plan. So we have 52 play fields, and we were looking to update those. And we quickly realized about over 60% of them were rated fair to poor. So where do we begin? So we began to look at everything we do through this equity lens and equity framework. And Minneapolis had done some great work around prioritizing their capital updates using equity. So we looked at their model and really adapted it for the Milwaukee market and kind of looked how can we change things and how does it work for our system. So we developed an equity prioritization. That's how we choose which playfields are first to get updated, and then kind of took a deeper dive into equity and looked at it. How do we use equity when doing our community engagements and our planning sessions? So, and even staff training on equity, and it's become a very big focus for our department.
Absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in our discussion, for sure. So thank you, Pam. And up next, we have Sam Subedi, who is the Engagement Coordinator for Parks for New Portlanders program for the City of Portland, Parks and Recreation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Subedi. And as Jared said, I am the Engagement Coordinator at Parks for New Portlanders program, division of Portland Parks and Rec. So the goal and vision of my program is to engage and integrate refugee and immigrants into happy and healthy life of the city. So I do that, or we do that by doing 3 things. One is increasing access to our programs, services, and activities. The second, we create culturally responsive activities. And the third, by partnering with the refugee and immigrant community partners and organizations. And also, we have, City of Portland has a lot of super duper programs and services. So we try to connect the refugee and immigrant, and this program bridges that gap. So as Portland is growing, equity is our priority. And we create programs that makes refugee immigrants belong to this city. So that's how we get that goal of engaging and happy and healthy down the road. So that's how we measure the happiness. So I think we talked about that more. So yeah, that's it for me now.
Great. All right, thank you, Sam. And last but not least, we have my colleague, Allison Coleman from NRPA, who is the Senior Program Manager working on the Commit to Health and Parks for Inclusion initiatives.
Thanks, Jared. Hi, everybody. As Jared said, I'm Allison Coleman. I'm a Senior Program Manager here at NRPA, and I work on our health and wellness team. As Jared said, I manage primarily our Commit to Health initiative, which is really focused on implementing a set of evidence-based healthy eating and physical activity standards in out-of-school time sites. So thinking of those summer camp programs, before and after school programs that serve kids in your communities, and really working to make those places as healthy as they can be, so that we are fostering the best possible health and wellness outcomes for youth. So there's certainly an equity component to that work, being that oftentimes low income and underserved communities struggle with making sure that there's quality program that exists there. And they also tend to struggle with healthy food access, having safe physical activity opportunities. So we're really working with sites on making sure that their programs are meeting these standards and ensuring that kids have access to the daily physical activity recommendations, healthy foods when they're in their care, and a safe place to be when school's out of session. And then, as Jared also mentioned, I'm managing our Parks for Inclusion initiative, which was launched just about a year ago, actually, at our annual conference in New Orleans. And it's really our commitment to ensuring that all people can enjoy the benefits of local parks and recreation. And through this, we have set a 3-year target of engaging 1 million people in additional health and wellness opportunities in their local parks. And we'll be reaching those through providing supports as far as resource development, professional development opportunities for park and rec professionals, working to get some funding to support built environment enhancements and programmatic work that really targets some specific populations. So NRPA actually has identified 4 main target groups for that initiative based on historical marginalization of these groups and a lack of access to the benefits of parks and recreation. Those groups are racial and ethnic minorities or people of color, those who identify as LGBTQ+, people with physical and cognitive disabilities, as well as their caregivers, and refugees and immigrants. So we're really working on creating resources that focus on engaging and targeting those populations in order to make sure that they have a more equitable access to both programs and facilities and spaces in local parks. So really happy to be here today. I'm happy to answer questions about what NRPA is doing from both an equity and an inclusion perspective.
Great. Thank you, Allison. And so before we dive right in here, I'd just like to make sure that everyone knows how to ask questions and how to use Zoom. So all attendees are currently muted and you're in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please use the question and answer option, which you can find on the bottom toolbar of your Zoom page, and it's the Q&A box. You're also welcome to type questions into the chat box. We have someone managing that. So make sure to get your questions there. If you're having any issues, please let us know in the chat box as well, and one of my colleagues will be able to assist you. We will also be posting links to resources. I already see that some are on there in the chat box. And we're also going to be posting a link to a brief survey that we'd like you to complete at the end to help us improve this learning series. And also, so you know, we are streaming this live on Facebook, so if you're joining us there, welcome. And so lastly, just to let you know that this will be recorded and we will make this available on NRPA's website with the other videos from the learning series. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Go ahead and start submitting your questions to the Q&A box. And I just want to take a minute, though, in order to kind of set the scene for this discussion to talk about equity. And I want to make sure that we're all on the same page of what exactly equity is. And so to answer that, I'd like to share with you this image from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so it's the image of these bikes here. And so equity and equality are often used interchangeably, but they mean pretty different things. And so equality, as you can see at the top of the image, is when everyone receives the equal amount of investment. And while that sounds fair, it assumes that all people start from the same place, which just isn't true. So equity, then, looking at the bottom part of the picture, is about ensuring that everyone receives the appropriate investment for where they are. So under equality, as you can see, everyone receives the same bike, but it doesn't meet the needs of every person. Now with equity, we're recognizing that each person starts at a different place, and each cyclist then receives the appropriate bike. So the same principle is true when we talk about park usage and access, right? So equal investment across the board is not really the best approach because some communities have historically been underserved and they need more investment. And so that's pretty much what this image articulates. And so with that being said, let's start thinking about equity in terms of park and recreation. So I'm going to launch a poll that I would like all of you to take part in. And the question is, let me pull it up here. So the question is, where has your agency incorporated equity guidelines, practices, or policies? And you can select all that apply there. And so I'll give you all a few seconds to vote. So take a look at the different options there. Great. All right, and I'll stop the poll in 10 seconds. And okay, so let's take a look at the results here, which you should be able to see now. So it looks like a lot of folks, looks like 67% of folks said community engagement, which is great. Also park planning, design, those are the top ones. Not so much with park maintenance, and agency and staffing, great, and programming as well. Excellent. So that's what we're here to talk about today, is just a few of these, and then hopefully our panelists can give some perspective on a few of these. So let me exit out of that there. And let's go ahead then and start our conversation with a broad question for our panelists. And so they've already touched a little bit about equity in their work and just generalizing about what they do. And so I'm wondering if you could actually go into some more detail about the specifics of equity in what you do every day. And anyone is welcome to kick us off.
I'm happy to kick us off. So this is Allison again, and great question, Jared. I think from NRPA's perspective, it's really a national organization and really looking to build upon what's happening in the field and help to continue scaling equitable efforts across parks and recreation. We are really focused on acknowledging the historical injustices that have really, continued to take place over time and still exist today in many of our communities. We know that low-income, underserved communities often face significant barriers when it comes to the social determinants of health, things like educational opportunities, quality jobs and stable jobs, access to healthcare, access to healthy food, and access to places and spaces where they can engage in park and recreation programming or physical activity. So, from our standpoint, we are really looking at providing resources to park and rec professionals, and again, hopefully someday more funding to help support your efforts as you really focus in on these communities. And oftentimes, these communities tend to be predominantly minority communities who for generations have, faced persistent poverty and again, barriers when it comes to these social determinants of health. So, that's really kind of from NRPA's perspective, what we are looking to do and really working to address those significant health disparities that exist across those vulnerable populations.
Great. I'm happy to jump in here as well. I think, I'm in Buffalo, New York, and we have an extremely high poverty rate, and we have a lot of very segmented neighborhood conditions, and we have sort of 4 predominant neighborhoods: north, south, east, and west. And I think where a lot of the challenges that we have found when we're looking to kick off a project has been in 2 sides of community engagement, where a community may not trust the community leaders, right? So the local government or the local council, that they don't have our best interest at heart. They're not interested in what we have to say. They're not interested in how our community could be shaped to better support us. And then there's the lack of trust from the community leaders on what they might actually hear from the community participants. I think as designers, we often hear the owners say, well, we want to do community engagement, but we're not quite sure what we're going to hear. And so that's been, right away out of the gate, we're dealing with a pretty significant issue that can shape a project to go very well or to go very poorly. And so where we have found that the team building efforts have gone a long way in sort of creating a space around trust. And if you look at sort of, the basic hierarchy of needs that has been around Maslow's hierarchy of needs for a long time, trust and security are at the very bottom of that pyramid. And if you don't have that, it's very hard for you to move forward as a group, let alone to solve problems. So we have found that trust building has to be right out of the gate a very high priority. The interesting thing about going to where people are, particularly of diverse neighborhoods, means that we're meeting in places that have value to them. So we might be meeting on Wednesday night Bible study night. We might be meeting on, an afternoon festival or an afternoon day at the local market. And it's important for us that we're going to where those communities are already gathering, particularly if they're refugee communities or communities that have some language barriers, or they're not really looking in the local paper for the ad that's this big that says come to the public meeting at this fire hall that's across town. Instead, we're bringing the public meeting to them, and we might do it at a library, we might do it at a grocery store, we might do it at a local kids sporting event. But the key for us is to be able to go to where those communities are gathering, where they're spending time, where they're in conversation with people, and offering an opportunity for us to build some trust, and then move conversation forward after we have some established trust. The project can take on a really different perspective.
Absolutely.
All right.
And Joy, I'd like to just touch on that a little bit. You talk about building trust and going into these communities. How do you know if you're engaging the right people in a project?
Well, we try to engage as many people as possible, right? So we want people from the neighborhood, but we also want businesses in the area. We want visitors, potential visitors in the area. We kind of want to know who's there and why they love that place, why they're committed to that place, and then let us know if we should be talking to your friends in that place. I think we're trying to do some scouting ahead of time We try to build a really great committee or steering committee. And the steering committee often will have, you know, in a typical project, you might have the Department of Public Works and Community Development Leader and the Parks and Recreation Department. But we've been pushing for our steering committees to also have representatives from like local families or local artists and musicians, local people who are, you know, big into Scouts or the Y, so that our participants, even at a steering committee level, are much broader than just the traditional project management or project leadership team. And then we rely on those individuals coming at a committee level to also help us to identify what neighborhoods we really need to be engaging with, and what language do they speak, and how might we adjust a team building game or a team building activity in order for there to be an understanding across a cultural language or an expectation of how you participate is being reached. So that our steering committees become really important, not just at a project planning level, but also to help guide us to be reaching to the right places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else have anything to say on that?
I'd like to ask the group, those that are tuning in, if they wanted to chat in what's been their most effective community engagement strategy and how are they meeting those people. A lot of folks indicated that they are thinking about equity within their community engagement and outreach. So would love to hear what you all are doing in your communities too, if you want to just chat it into the box.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. That's great.
I can jump in too and talk a little about ours. So once we use equity as our framework to select which playfields we're going to update, and then once we've chosen that for each playfield update, we spend about a year in community engagement in the beginning. So really identifying the community stakeholders, doing meetings, spending a lot of time in the neighborhood, spending a lot of time in the playfields. And we found definitely, like Joy said, going to the people is one of those things that definitely works. Participating in events that are already built around the neighborhood. And we are governmental. So, I mean, we're part of the school district and part of Milwaukee Recreation. So building trust we're new at this. None of these have been updated since the 50s to 60s. So it's been a really long time. So they've seen disinvestment in their neighborhood for, you know, most people's lifetime or longer. And so building credibility, and since we're new, and so now we're getting our first group under construction is really helping us, but it's having really strong community partners that kind of vouch for our credibility through this process too, and making sure, again, the stakeholders and the key groups are really, if there is a neighborhood association, we lean heavily on them to help us kind of understand the culture of their neighborhood. And if there's not, then we have to dig a little deeper and really research who are the community leaders. Is it the religious organizations? Is it the schools? And if there's not, can we help find some of these other nonprofit partners to help us kind of build some, you know, neighborhood, help them bond and come together. And one of our first projects, there's now a community block watch that was formed through the help of another nonprofit. And now they meet in the playfield once a month. And that community is really beginning to come together. And it's great to see.
Absolutely. And Sam, I'd be interested in your perspective on that, working specifically with the refugee and immigrant community.
Yeah, let me go back to my own story. When I came to Portland in 2008, after living in a refugee camp for almost 20 years, when I got here, I had a plastic bag and $10 in my pants pocket to start my new life. So upon my arrival, I didn't know how to access city services, park services, where to rent, how to rent, and what are the process to participate in the government. And I had totally lost all my trust with the government since getting evicted from Bhutan in early my young age. So I didn't have those things to start with. So what I did was I started gathering communities from 4 different groups, Burmese, Bhutanese, Iraqi, and Turkish Russian in nearby my apartment, a park. So after that, I was able to connect with an employee from Portland Parks and Rec, and we started Portland World Cup Soccer in 2010. So next year will be its 10 years. So I'm excited that we took that far. So that's how I was able to connect with parks. And so fast forward in 2015, after the successful execution of Portland World Cup Soccer, where we were able to bring more than 30 countries, communities, and language in the soccer field, and not, I mean, soccer speaks its own language. I mean, you don't need the language. Soccer is kind of universal. So we use soccer as a vehicle to bring all this community together. So when I do the outreach, I go to the ethnic stores, I go to community garden, I go to cultural events, I go to talk to the leaders in individual community. We have interpreters and translation materials to reach out to those newest community. And also, end of the day, they know where I live, and we chatted all the time. And yeah, so we know the problems and issues. And sometimes I'm the face, right? So there is more trust on that. So fast forward in 2015, Portland Parks and Recreation City Commissioner Amanda Fritz created Parks for New Portlanders program. So coming from that World Cup Soccer, so the successful execution and serving all these communities. So we were now under this program, we are focusing more on youth and families together. So we're new to Portland. So now we have done so many events after that, and we have been involved so many. A recent example was Walk with Refugees and Immigrants on August 19th, and we were able to bring 74 community organizations together to work with, to inspire and to bring more compassion to refugee immigrant families, and make them feel welcome in Portland. Thank you.
That's great.
And actually, if I could just say one last thing too on this kind of topic, Jared, I just noticed the comment in the box about allowing youth to have a seat at the table, you know, really early and often, and making sure that they're part of the planning and the engagement process. And I just think that that is really so critical, especially when we're talking about equity. You know, there was a study a few years ago, and I think you referenced this in your blog post, but park use is really, it's culturally embedded and it's inherited from generation to generation. Many people of color in this country, many people that did not grow up going to their parks, whether it was because of practices or policies that exist like Jim Crow laws, or just a fear of not feeling safe in their parks, they've not passed that down to their children. So we're seeing that disparity that exists between different generations when people are not accessing their parks. And really, in order to keep sustaining the park and recreation industry and foster the next generation of environmental stewards and park users and address these disparities, we need to get kids into these parks, and we need to make sure that they have a quality park that they can go to. So I think really engaging youth and finding those figures of trust in your community that have that reach within those groups is just so critical in all park planning efforts and all program planning efforts. So I love what Sam has done with Parks for New Portlanders and really tapping into that youth empowerment. You know, love the relationships when you can build upon those school partnerships as well, and thinking about the faith-based community and meeting people where they are, but also making sure that youth have that voice at the table. Really important.
And also, Jared, if I can add, so we have around 10 community youth ambassadors. So they speak 15 different languages, and there are 4 Muslim youth. So they are the community ambassadors. So they represent community, and they are one of the driving force for this program also. That's why we are so successful, and we are very connected to the community.
That's great. Thank you. And so I'd like to, excuse me, I'd like to touch a little bit on, we've talked about some programming now, which is great, making sure that you're meeting the community where they are. and I'd like to touch on planning and policy when it comes to equity. And so one effective strategy is to encourage equitable investment, right? And you do that through equity-based prioritization plans. And so I have a poll question to send out to the audience, which I will do right now. And it's a very basic question. And do you currently use equity-based criteria to prioritize capital improvements or park master plan efforts? And so I'll give us about 30 seconds to answer that. And the last vote. And, okay. So I'll share the results here. 58% say yes and 42% say no. So I think this is a good segue then going into talking about the work in Milwaukee, especially. And so thinking about the playfields work, I'm just wondering then, Pam, if you could talk a little bit about how Milwaukee came to see the necessity for an equity-based prioritization plan and how it was developed.
I'll talk a little about Milwaukee. So if people don't know, Milwaukee is unfortunately one of the most segregated cities in the country. And if you look at, for all children under age 18, poverty levels around 40%. So high level of poverty, high level of incarceration of people of color in the city, and segregation. So when you look at it, even from a school district standpoint, we had a problem of equity in educating children. So we kind of looked holistically at this issue. And so when it came to updating the playgrounds or the playfields, so playfield, for those that don't know, is kind of a middle size. It's an active park space. So it has baseball and soccer and field houses, and it's a heavily programmed space. So we were doing great in the programming side, but the physical quality of the spaces, like I said, hadn't been updated since the 1950s and 1960s. And that time, neighborhoods have changed, and how we recreate had changed. And so when we looked to update these, how do we do this equitably? So we went through the analysis first and figured out, what is the condition? And then we realized a lot of them were in poor condition. So we developed the equity plan. So we looked at two other factors. And then the first factor is what we call neighborhood. And that factor took into account race and crime and poverty levels and income. And then we looked at the second factor, which was the total population of the neighborhood, population of kids under 18. And then proximity, we put this in population because it was the level of other parks and other services within the walking distance of those neighborhoods. So then we can combine all three of those factors together to create an equity rating. So if two playfields had the exact same amount of need to be updated, the neighborhoods that were more challenged, that's where we would start our investment in the neighborhoods. So far it's been working out very well, and we went through a whole GIS mapping and statistical analysis of how this would work to make it kind of a defensible process, because there is so much need, and it's challenging when groups came and say, why can't you update our playfield this year? So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious then, what are the strategies that you all use to bring leadership on board to support this sort of equity work?
Leadership in our organization, or leadership?
Yeah, in the agency or in the city leadership.
That's one of the interesting things. So in Milwaukee, we're a little different. So the neighborhood playfields are, the capital improvements, the operations, and the maintenance are all done through the school district. So Milwaukee Recreation is part of the school district. So we do meet occasionally with the city and work with them on projects, but this is really school district led. And I think having a school district and really that believes in equity and has a focus, our leadership is on board, and I think everybody is encouraged. So I think we were very fortunate in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a focus of so it's cultural to our organization, and that's more recent, but it's great. And
great. And so, sort of touching on a question that someone has asked, and this, Pam, this can go to you or to anyone that would like to answer. How do you ensure that once you have it prioritized, once you have equity prioritized, you have some plans, that the investments are actually made in the communities? And how do you encourage private donations and funders to also make these parks a priority?
So it's a two-part. So we make sure that, we're making sure it's in the neighborhood just by the fact that that's the one we've chosen. But it's really critical that we go in and we say, we're going to update your playfield, but what are your needs? What do you want to see? This isn't driven, so that space is chosen as a priority to update, but what the physical development looks like is driven by the neighborhood. And so we start with community engagement. We start with kids first, and we spend for a couple months really working with kids, and then we expand that out to the larger stakeholders and kind of try and integrate the whole community. So we're asking them, what do you need? How do we make this the social and recreation hub of your neighborhood? And what do these developments look like? So that's the first part. And then the second part, I'll let you ask that again.
Yeah, so the second part was just how do you encourage private donations or funders to make these parks a priority?
We are working on that. Right now, we are investing heavily in these neighborhoods, and we really believe it's part of the community. So we do work with foundations, and we do apply for grants. We recently held an opportunity for people, for the businesses in Milwaukee and community leaders to come in and hear about what we're doing, and we're working on a sponsorship program. And again, we've been on this path for about 2 years, and my position is new, and taking over the capital improvements of the playfield is new for MPS and Milwaukee Recreation. So we are just beginning our stages of really trying to get community involved into helping them, encouraging them to be a funding partner as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so someone's asking you specifically, Pam, if you could describe your criteria listed in your study, proportion of value.
So, sorry, I have to look down for a moment here.
Sure.
And put on my glasses. All right, here we go. So the neighborhood neighborhood characteristics is 25% of the equity score, population is 25%, and condition is 50%. And then we even have a breakdown too of how we decide which in the neighborhood: income, poverty, race, and crime, all develop into that formula.
Okay. Great. Thank you. So I'm just looking at a couple questions coming in here.
And if anybody has our equity guide, I can get it to you all to post. It is on our website, Milwaukee Recreation website, under master plan. Oh, there it is.
Yeah. Yep. Rachel just posted it to the chat box there. So if you're interested in checking out Milwaukee's playfields prioritization plan, you can find the link right there in the chat box. So I'd also like to touch on, since we're coming down here to a few minutes left, I want to make sure that we have time to touch on some other policy initiatives and things that maybe a Milwaukee-sized prioritization plan isn't possible for you at the moment. And so I'm curious, Allison, I know Parks for Inclusion is looking into a policy guide. And so I'm wondering if you would say, or what you would say, are the essential equity policies that an agency should consider to implement?
Yeah, definitely. NRPA is actually releasing, I think, 2 really great resources within the next 6 months or so. One is going to speak to really the community engagement piece, which our panelists have really spoken about today, but so critical for, as you know, any park planning or equity-driven process. So that will be coming out in the next couple of months. And then we're also going to be releasing a best practices guide for creating really an inclusion policy, but it will certainly focus on equity as well, and removing those barriers. And then once those barriers are removed, how can we best make sure that all of these populations are included and represented and at the table for any of these planning processes as well. So, really from a policy standpoint, I think one of the most critical things is acknowledging who your target audiences are and explicitly stating that within the policy and why. Making sure that you are very explicit about that. I think that oftentimes we talk about low income and underserved communities, but there's really more to it than that. And of course, that's going to differ, community by community. You all know your community the best. You all are the ones engaged in your community. So making sure that your equity or inclusion policy is really catered to the specific needs of your community and those target populations is really critical. It's definitely an important component to get that leadership buy-in and that support, both at the community level and also at the organizational level. So if you're really a champion for equity within your agency, that is so awesome. But it's really, really important that you build that support throughout your entire organization. Within the creation process, within the adoption process, within the implementation process, there certainly needs to be that community engagement piece. Everyone should be aware of what you are doing, both the community and again, organization-wide. All of your staff should receive training on it to make sure that they can effectively implement any new policy that's created. And you should also, seek feedback from those community members, explaining why you're doing this, why it's important to your community, why it's important for your park and recreation planning efforts moving forward and thinking about the future, and making sure that people can speak to that within your staff. That's really, really critical as well. Those are kind of some of the main things that our guide will focus on. We also will be including a template within that guide. And it's really based on some successful policies that we've seen from organizations like the City of Seattle, Portland Parks and Recreation, agencies that are doing this and are leading these efforts already. So I think that it should be a really great resource for folks. And again, that should be out in probably January of 2019, so this coming January.
Great. And so we have another question that's come in. And so if anyone on the panel is familiar or has any idea with this, but have there been any studies that show the value for equitable distribution that describe things like improved property values, lower crime rates, et cetera?
NRPA has a number of resources that actually touch on this. We can probably share those in the chat box if Rachel can pull some of them up, but we release a report every year about the economic impact of parks, and by investing in low income and underserved communities and the park and recreation systems themselves in those communities, there is certainly an upward trend in housing prices, in businesses that want to come and set up shop in those communities. So really by investing in the infrastructure themselves, you're definitely going to see some economic benefits. And we have a lot of data that supports that. I think Rachel just typed in a link to the box there. So definitely check that out, and we can certainly provide some follow-up resources with that too.
Great. And so the last topic I'd like to touch on is addressing barriers when it comes to trying to address equity issues in your communities. And so this could be things like you have mentioned already, this idea of this distrust of government that exists, and also maybe thinking of it from the perspective of are there any conflicts of interest when it comes to donors and trying to use private money? Do your donors try to steer you in a particular direction that might not be the best for your community? And so I'd like each of you to touch on some issues and barriers that you had to face and ways and strategies that you've overcome those barriers. And anyone is welcome to start.
I think sometimes one of the barriers can be, especially with trust, is I don't look like a lot of the neighborhoods or most of the neighborhoods I'm working in right now. So from the moment I walk in the room, there's kind of this, it's not just trust, but there's a wariness of who I am, what I represent. So if I can partner with either the neighborhood organization or trusted community leaders, and we can come in as a group and start the meetings and presenting kind of as a team, or have people from our agency that speak the language, and we've done meetings, a number of meetings with some good partners in the language of the community we're working in, and that's really successful. So again, anything you can do to break down a barrier from the beginning of a meeting is really helpful, and show people that, we're in your neighborhood, we want to speak your language, we want to, have people right from the beginning that are the people you trust in your neighborhood. And I think that really helps break down a lot of barriers in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to touch on a different space of barrier, I guess, and something that we as consultants often find challenging is the budget, right? The budget for the design process, the budget for engagement, the budget for the actual implementation. And we'll propose a lot of community engagement, and some pushback that we often get is, how can you possibly afford to have this much engagement? And right, our response tries to not be, how could you afford not to have this level of engagement if you want to have ultimately a successful project? But how do we frame the style of engagement that we want to do inside a traditional request for proposal and scope of services that an owner has requested and that a design team is expected to supply. So we've been creative with, we'll have a traditional public meeting, you've already budgeted for that, but we'll make that public meeting be on the sidewalk. And we'll have, some local flavors of food, and do it in a way that kids and families are supported. Or if we were going to do site analysis as the design team, let's do our site analysis walking tour with the community, because we were already going to pay for site analysis. So we've had to be creative in terms of how the level of engagement that we can supply that we know is beneficial to a project, but we're also kind of keeping to the way the owner team might be often used to purchasing or scoping that work and budgeting for that work.
And I think one other thing I'll add in from just the funding perspective and working with private funders or donors, it's so critical to tell that story, to really make them understand what are the needs within your community, and why it's so important to invest in these low income and underserved areas. Look at the data that's out there. Both of these organizations have done a great job in using the data that already exists. It's not hard to find. You can check with your local public health department to determine these health disparities that exist. But I'm just reminded of a visit that I went on a few years ago in the city of Detroit, where there was a 13-year life expectancy difference between two neighborhoods that were 2 miles apart, 13 years just because of the neighborhood that someone lives in. And that's just not right. And I think that most donors and funders will tend to agree with you on that. So when you're working with the private sector and you may have a little bit more flexibility in sort of telling that story and where investment is needed, I think it's really critical to look to the data, also obtain that qualitative data from the community, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, and really share that to get the buy-in and the support.
And then Sam, I'll let you have the last word here.
So I think I'm a practical guy. I make a difference in the community. I work with them in the field. So I have some just working with community leaders that brings the trust, because you can talk to them directly, and also passing the policies and practices that is welcoming to everybody, not just one group or other, but making them making the policies and practices easy and welcoming. So that may bring trust too. And also attending the events. So I do my private and professional. So when I'm not with the job on from 5 to midnight or Saturday, Sundays, I spend my own money. I'm not recommending anybody to do that, but when I do, that brings trust also, that I'm not just a city guy, but I'm a community guy. I'm with them all the time. So yeah, I invest in that way also. And also, if as a city, we can attend events and go to the communities and tell them that this city belongs to you, and these parks belongs to you. So welcome to the parks or something. That kind of assurance, and that brings trust to the community. So that's what I've been doing. And when we do events, bring them on, ask their logos to be part of the event, and that shows some care and trust also.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, everyone. Before we end today, because we are at the 2 o'clock mark, Eastern time anyway. So before we end today, I'd just like to ask you to complete the post question and answer survey and leave your feedback on how we can improve these question and answer sessions in the future. The link is in the chat box, and it should also be up on your screen on your web browser. In the next week or two, we will be posting videos from all of our great panelists talking about their initiatives and addressing some very specific things. And so in order to view those, you can go to the 10-Minute Walk webpage on NRPA's website. And again, we're going to be posting those in the next couple of weeks. Really quickly, I just wanted to share these last couple things with you all, just so it's on your radar. And so we have our NRPA annual conference coming up at the end of September, and we're going to be holding, we're going to be having some 10-minute walk sessions. And so there is a blog post on the Open Space blog and podcast page of NRPA's website, and I believe the link will also pop up in the chat box. So if you're going to conference and you want to check out some 10-minute walk related sessions, please check out that blog post. Also, this October, we are celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the 10-Minute Walk campaign with National Walk to a Park Day on October 10th. And so on 10/10, we will be highlighting the importance of parks and public green space, and celebrate mayors and civic leaders who work hard for park access and quality in their cities. And so if you're a part of our 10-Minute Walk Parkology page, we'll definitely be posting some things there about how we can celebrate. November and December, thinking about the learning series, we will build off of our past 2 topics of partnerships and now equity to talk about community engagement, which we've touched on a lot in this discussion. And we will have videos from peers uploaded to the 10-Minute Walk webpage in early November. And then on December 6th, we're going to be holding our next Q&A. And so we hope that you will join us for that as well. And information on that registration will be coming up in late October. And so if you still have some questions, I know some were still coming in and we didn't get to address everybody, we want to continue this conversation, and so you can go to our 10-Minute Walk Parkology page. I'm happy to connect you to our panelists here as well if you have some very specific questions to their work, and we'll make sure that we can have some really robust discussions around equity. And so with that said, I just want to thank Joy, Pam, Sam, and Allison for being on our panel today, and to all of you for joining us. Look out for our videos to be posted in the next couple weeks, and we'll hope you'll join us in December when we discuss community engagement. So have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.